The spread of the gospel is itself spiritual warfare. Stephen is not just going down and healing people, he is taking the fight to the real enemy. He's recognizing that the Jewish leaders are not his real enemy. They're not the real enemy of the gospel. Well, hello and welcome to Sunday Morning with Hope Valley Church. I'm Pastor Sam. I'm the lead pastor here at Hope Valley, and today we are continuing in our verse-by-verse study through the book of Acts. And today we're going to be picking up in chapter 8. And just to give you an intro into chapter 8, we've just finished chapter 7, and in that chapter, Stephen had just become the first Christian martyr. This is actually just the last lesson that we covered, right? In the last couple of verses, after speaking to the Sanhedrin, after being on trial with them for really somewhat false, twisted accusations, he had said some things to them about the nature of Jesus that they just could not bear to hear, and so they had executed him, and so he had become the first Christian martyr. And we covered that in depth in the last couple of lessons. But he was killed for what? Really, he was killed for speaking the truth about Jesus and for rebuking the religious leaders. This is ultimately what he died for. And so now in chapter 8, we will see a huge shift in the early church story, right? Because the people who had really been together since the day of Pentecost back in Acts chapter 2, we're now going to see them be scattered, really, and a lot of them are going to go back to the regions that they came from. And if you go back to our lesson on Acts chapter 2, you see that there were a lot of Jews in Jerusalem who became the early church, and they were from all over the Mediterranean area. And a lot of them had remained in Jerusalem now for who knows how long. It might have been quite a long time. And now we're going to see them be scattered and go back out to their areas. And as they do, the gospel then begins to geographically spread through the Mediterranean area. So some pretty exciting things is coming as we go in the book of Acts. And so we're going to pick up here in Acts chapter 8, verse 1. And as we read through, I'm going to read verse 1 through verse 8. As we read, I want you to ask yourself this question, kind of have it in the back of your mind as we go. And that question is, what battle should we be fighting? Okay? What battle should we be fighting? And so let me read here verse 1. It says, Saul agreed with putting him to death. It's talking about Stephen. And on that day, a severe persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem. And all except the apostles were scattered throughout the land of Judea and Samaria. Devout men buried Stephen and mourned deeply over him. And Saul, however, was ravaging the church. He would enter house after house, drag off men and women, and put them in prison. So those who were scattered went on their way, preaching the word. And Philip went down to a city in Samaria and proclaimed the Messiah to them. And the crowds were all paying attention to what Philip said as they listened and saw the signs he was performing. For unclean spirits, crying out with a loud voice, came out of many who were possessed, and many who were paralyzed and lame were healed. So there was great joy in that city. Okay. There's actually a lot packed into those 8 verses. And so we're going to unpack those things now and kind of examine what we just read. Because, again, we're asking ourselves that question, what battle should we be fighting, right? And so, the first main point that I really see here in verses 1 through 8, the first thing we saw is that the execution of Stephen really ignited a full force assault on the church in Jerusalem, right? If you think through the book of Acts before this moment, Peter and John, other disciples, they were getting arrested, they were being put on trial, they were being questioned, they're being beat, maybe imprisoned. But it always kind of concluded with the Jewish leaders saying, hey, stop that, now go. And then they wouldn't stop, and then they would arrest them again and say, we told you to stop, now go. And really, with Stephen, it was almost like a last straw. And And after the execution of Stephen, it really ignited a full-on persecution of the church in Jerusalem to the point where Saul is being, who was there at Stephen's death, right? And it says here, he was fully in approval, fully in agreement with putting Stephen to death. Now he's being commissioned to go and just find the Christians and drag them off to jail because really the Jewish leadership had gotten to the point where they really had no more tolerance left for the church. And so we saw this in verse 1, right? When it said that on that day, and he's talking about this day that Stephen was killed, Luke cites that day as the day when severe persecution broke out against the entire church. And so Saul leads this campaign. Really clearly, Stephen's words and his actions had really created a threat in their eyes they could no longer ignore. So there's some significant points in the story there. And so then what happens, right? The church, the second big point we see is that the church scatters from Jerusalem. Once again, God is using change to advance his plan. And Luke is really clearly connecting this with the points that Stephen was making in his speech, right? Because Stephen had made the strong point that God works through innovation and change. And now here's a major change for the church in Jerusalem, and yet God is using it to advance his plan. Because in verse 4, Luke writes that those who were scattered, they went on their way, what? Shutting up about Jesus? Abandoning their faith? Leaving the church? No. It says they were scattered from the city and they went on their way preaching the gospel, right? So Luke is showing how the church was following the pattern of God's work that Stephen had talked about. We see that the Christians who fled, they may have mostly been the Hellenistic Jews, or in other words, the Jews that were not like native to the Jerusalem area. And it says all but the apostles, and yet we know from the later passages that not all the believing Jews left Jerusalem, right? And so the word all there may be referring to, everyone, all the Hellenistic Jews, maybe all of the out-of-towners. They scattered and they left Jerusalem. They went back home, maybe. And keep in mind that Stephen was one of the leaders among that group of Hellenistic Jews that were not, native to Jerusalem in that area. And yet the 12 apostles, all of whom were Hebraic Jews, they all stayed in Jerusalem, right? And so now the story leaves Jerusalem with these scattered Jews. It leaves Jerusalem with them, and it follows Philip up to Samaria. And keep in mind that back when we were covering Acts chapter 6, when it was listing these 7 leaders that were chosen to take care of the widows, Stephen was the first person listed. Philip was the second one. So Philip was one of those 7 guys, right? And so the story follows Philip now up to Samaria. And here's what we see with Philip. We see that Philip doesn't get distracted, right? He keeps the focus on the real enemy. And what do I mean by that, right? Well, he did not fight back against the Jewish leaders. It's, not only was Stephen loved by everybody, but it's probably a sure thing that him and Philip were very close and at least knew each other very well. And so Philip, he could have stayed, right? He could have fought back. He could have tried to use public opinion to stir up a riot, but he didn't do any of those things. Look here in verse 5. It says, Philip went down to a city in Samaria and proclaimed the Messiah to them, right? And so we see that he gave other people the opportunity to receive the message that the Jewish leaders had just rejected, right? So he doesn't get distracted. He keeps the focus on the real enemy because he doesn't fight back against the Jewish leaders at all. In fact, you don't see anyone in the church go, I can't believe they killed Stephen, let's get him. That doesn't happen. They scatter and they continue preaching the gospel, right? And we see not only does Stephen not fight back against the Jewish leaders, but he continues to focus his fight on the spiritual enemy. Look here in verse 6 and 7. It says, the crowds were all paying attention to what Philip said as they listened and saw the signs he was performing. Verse 7, for unclean spirits, crying out with a loud voice, came out of many who were possessed, and many who were paralyzed and lame were healed. And this is something that I want us to focus on today because the spread of the gospel is itself spiritual warfare. right? Stephen is not just going down and healing people. He is taking the fight to the real enemy. He's recognizing that the Jewish leaders are not his real enemy. They're not the real enemy of the gospel. The real enemy of the gospel is actually the spiritual forces that are imprisoning people and are causing all kinds of problems and bondage and disease in their life, right? And so the gospel itself is spiritual warfare because it brings healing and deliverance from demonic authorities. If you go back and read Luke chapter 4, verse 18 through 19, this is what Jesus said that he was coming to do, right? And so Philip knew which battle to fight, right? He knew that the Jewish leaders were not his real enemies. This is why he doesn't stay back and fight the Jewish leaders, right? Instead, he takes the fight to the demonic forces that are plaguing the people in Samaria. He goes, all right, I'm leaving. You guys had a chance in Jerusalem. You guys rejected the message. I'm taking the message to people who still need to be freed and healed and liberated, because the gospel is a battle, but it's not a battle against humans. It's a battle against spiritual forces, right? This might sound weird to us, but it's the truth. Look here, in Ephesians, Paul would later write about this to the Ephesians, when in chapter 6, verse 12 of that letter, he says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Just like Philip's struggle and the church's struggle was not against the Sanhedrin. It was not against the Jewish leaders. And I just want us to think about that for a minute, because how easy would it have been for any of us to go, all right, the Sanhedrin's got to go. That's it. They've gone too far. We're done. We're going to riot. We're going to kill them all. We're going to destroy the temple. Like, that's it. It'd be so easy for us to think that way. And yet we see zero people in the church acting that way. In the early church, no one is thinking that. They are like, I've got a mission from God. He said to spread the gospel. He said to heal people. He said to drive out demons. That's my fight. That's my battle. That's where I'm going, right? Because again, Ephesians 6, verse 12, Paul writes that our struggle is not against flesh and blood. We really need to remember that. But it's against the rulers and the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this darkness, against evil spiritual forces in the heavenly realms. The rulers and authorities he's talking about are not human rulers and authorities. They are spiritual authorities. And that might sound really weird and kooky and mysterious. And frankly, there's a lot of that we don't understand. And yet we know that those things are realities. And Paul is saying that's where our fight is. Our fight is with these enemies, not the human enemies. It's not against flesh and blood enemies. So we see that Philip knew which battle to fight. He knew the Jewish leaders were not his real enemies. But he trusted God to deal with the people who opposed the gospel. I think that's what we see, right? It doesn't mean the Jewish leaders didn't need justice brought to them. It doesn't mean that what they did wasn't wrong. It doesn't mean any of that stuff. It doesn't mean they just look and go, oh, well, just who cares that they killed Stephen? Let's just move on. No. He just knew that wasn't his fight, and he trusted God to deal with it. And if you go back and look at the way that Jesus instructed his disciples on these exact matters, you'll see kind of why they probably had this approach. Because look here in Matthew chapter 10, when Jesus was sending his disciples out to go and minister, he says this in verse 14. He says, if anyone does not welcome you or listen to your words, shake the dust off your feet when you leave that house or town. Truly, I tell you, it will be more tolerable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. That's a heavy thing Jesus is saying, right? Because he's instructing them, in other words, don't fight those people, don't attack those people, and don't treat them like their enemy. Trust me, on the day of judgment, I will deal with them. He gives this incredible comparison where he says Sodom and Gomorrah will receive less harsh judgment than the people who reject the gospel when you preach it to them. That's pretty wild when you think about it, right? But it's something that we can keep in mind so that we know how to focus our fight. Our fight's not on flesh and blood. It's on spiritual forces that are imprisoning people, that are tormenting people and that are bringing all manner of disease and you name it, right? Our battle is on liberating people from spiritual forces. It is not on attacking fellow human beings. They're not the enemy. And any humans that oppose the gospel, we know that God will handle that. Right? We got to keep our focus where it is. So that's what we see Philip doing. That's what we see the early church doing. So that's something for us to really focus on. So now that we've kind of unpacked this passage, what I really invite you to do is ask yourself some questions like, what are some of the big ideas that we see in this passage? What are some big ideas that you saw? Maybe I didn't point them out. And then how can you apply those ideas in your life, and maybe what would some of your next steps be? Okay, so as you're thinking about those questions, let me just share with you some of the things that I wrote down myself as I read through these 8 verses. Okay, first thing I wrote is that in this world, the very nature of the gospel is going to put us in conflict with people and with spiritual forces. Okay, the nature of the gospel, it will put us in conflict with people, and it will put us in conflict with spiritual forces. We've got to keep that in mind. That's obvious. I think that's obvious from this passage and many others, right? The second thing I wrote down is that spreading the gospel is itself warfare. But we have to stay pointed at the right enemy. And then I also wrote down here that people are not our enemies, even when they act like it. We have to see with spiritual eyes. And I think this is really important because we'll get tripped up really easily when we allow ourselves to perceive other people as being our enemy rather than, frankly, demonic forces that are tormenting and imprisoning people in our very community. That's our enemy. People are not the enemy. And so we have to learn to see with spiritual eyes. Even when a person's acting like my enemy, I refuse to see other people that way, right? And that's a big idea we can take from what we read here in Acts chapter 1, chapter 8, verse 1 through 8, right? So some of the applications I have written for myself are, first, I have to be prepared for opposition from people and not take it personally, right? If they could do what they did, right, and not start a riot against the Sanhedrin, then certainly I can receive a lot of things from people and not take it personally and not try and defend or get revenge is really the word I'm thinking of, right? And not try and take revenge on people. And so that starts with not taking things too personally. And I think that's an important lesson. It's a difficult lesson, but if we're going to be truly mature, we have to be less reactive and less prone to take everything personally against us and recognize that when people are rejecting the gospel message, they're not rejecting us, they're rejecting Jesus. And that should actually stir us to compassion for them, not anger and resentment. And then the last thing I have written as an application for myself is I have to see sharing the gospel as the means of liberating oppressed people. And I think this is a really helpful perspective shift because a lot of times we don't share the gospel or our experience of Jesus or our testimonies because we're afraid of how it's going to be received. And maybe we're thinking about sharing the gospel in terms of like, this is a message I'm trying to get people to agree with. I'm trying to make it appealing. It's an assignment. It's a job that I have. But I really think it's a major shift we need to make. We'll look and go, sharing the gospel is not primarily any of those things. It's primarily the job of liberating people who are oppressed. The gospel is the message of freedom in Christ. And there are people who are oppressed and they're in bondage and they need somebody to liberate them. And Jesus has sent us to do that by preaching the gospel so that they can hear and receive Jesus as their King. And so that's a big thing for me to focus on, and I'll continue to focus on. I encourage you to do the same. All right. Just as we close up here on this lesson and reflect, I want to give you first just something I encourage you to pray about today. Maybe once you're done listening to this, watching this message, just pause and pray and ask the Lord to give us spiritual eyes. Ask Him to give you spiritual eyes to see past the distractions and to see the real battle that's in front of you. That's something we really daily need to pray for, because physical things and natural things are so distracting, and so they're so obvious to us, but spiritual things are not obvious to us, right? And so we need to pray, Lord, would you give me, eyes, spiritual eyes, to see beyond distractions and to see the real battle that I'm facing, that my family's facing, that my community is facing, right? And then here's a devotional question I've got for you this week. We all have certain things that we're passionate about, things that can easily draw us into an argument or make us angry for days, right? We all have those things. So the question is, what are some things like that in your life that are distracting you from the real spiritual battles in your life and the life of your family? I'm going to ask that question again, okay? When you're thinking about those things that you're passionate about, that can easily draw you into an argument, make you angry for days, what are some things like that in your life that are distracting you from the real spiritual battles in your life and the life of your family? Okay, think about that question this week. I know it's a big one. Think about it, because we all have real spiritual battles in front of us that, frankly, we're not fighting because we don't have the eyes and the awareness to see them. And part of the reason is because we're letting things distract us that should not be distracting us. Okay? Think about those this week. I hope this lesson's been helpful for you, and I just hope that you'll continue with us as we continue to study through the book of Acts. All right? Well, in the meantime, I pray that God will bless you, and you have a great day. All right. Bye-bye.
We are so glad you have joined us today. To learn more about Hope Valley Church and get access to free resources, just go to www.hopevalley.church. There, you will also find links to connect with us on Facebook and Instagram, as well as links to our podcasts, now available on Apple, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please take a moment to like and subscribe so you can stay up with new videos coming out every week. Hope Valley is a church based in Winchester, Virginia that meets in homes around the region. So if you'd like to find out more about home churches, how they work, and how to locate one near you, just go to hopevalley.church/house. Thanks again for joining us, and may God bless you today.